Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about fund governance. I've shortened it to investment governance because I think that the setup is more appropriate in general outsourced settings, not just fund structures, but also in other structures. So we'll get to speak about it in a moment. First, I got around 24 slides, so hopefully we have enough time for interaction, if there's any interest, of course. What I would like to kick off with is to understand a little bit about investment products or funds, because they have some complexities in there that nowadays we're not necessarily always aware of those, let's say. First of all, investment products are products which can where beneficial owners, clients, investors can redeem. And that is tricky because typically if you buy a product, you cannot get your money back. However, in fund products, you actually can redeem, or in investments, and this means that the investment manager today has money to invest, tomorrow he may not have. And that leads, of course, to a situation which needs management. The second element is that fund products, investment products, are products which are created by the investment manager. And what I want to highlight with that is that this is kind of an asymmetrical situation where the investment manager has, of course, the power to write fund prospectus together with their lawyers and change this and decide on the setup. Of course, they also have their income from these products, and investors typically are not part of the process of writing fund prospects, fund documentation, or choosing service providers. So there's an asymmetry there in the power in this kind of setup. The third element is that funds operate under an outsourcing model. And what I mean to say with that is that if you look at a fund vehicle, that is typically a legal entity, a company without own staff. And an outsourcing, and then the legal vehicle outsources all the work to other service providers, right, to fund administrators, to the investment manager, external legal counsel, etc. So this kind of legal vehicle does not have own staff and has only indirect influence. Now, the outsourcing model that a fund has is also common, of course, with family offices, small pension funds, and any other structures. So I prefer to talk about investment governance and not so much about fund governance, because the governance issues that come out of an outsourcing model apply throughout these different investment companies, be it family office, funds, etc. So these are some complexities, let's say, that need to be managed and people need to be aware of it. And I'll come to some more detail later on. Here you see a slide from Margaret Cullen that depicts the governance architecture. Now, we start off typically with talking about corporate governance, and corporate governance assumes an integrated structure. That means that you have shareholders, they're being represented in the firm by a board of directors, and in the firm you have the CEO, management, etc. And if somebody screws up in the structure, you fire the person. Typically, a company will have their own research department, they will have their production department, etc. Right, so that is an integrated setting, typically, and the governance of that is, of course, very overseeable. If you look at a fund structure, the legal vehicle is actually there, here at number 2, investment fund product, and it has a board of directors, with what I mean, what I said before, without own staff. However, you see all these service providers here, custodian, distributor, etc., and these are all outsourced relationships, right? So it is important to understand that the fund vehicle itself is a legal structure which basically outsources all the work to other parties. The governance of that, of course, is quite tricky, because basically the relationships between a fund vehicle, the product, and these service providers is managed through legal contracts. And if you are in the fund space, you know, of course, that sending data from one third party to another can be tricky. If something goes wrong, etc., etc. Right? Then it becomes tricky to find out what's going on in the whole what I call investment construct. You can think about a trade that will go through various parties before it gets booked in and reported back. If that trade gets stuck somewhere in the chain, you can ask yourself, okay, which of those parties has made a mistake, and then the legal question becomes who owns it, right? Who owns the mistake, but also who owns the asset. Now, if you think also about the typical fund setting, the example I like to take is the manager that sits in London, the investment manager sits in London, the vehicle itself, the corporate vehicle is maybe a Cayman vehicle or a Luxembourg vehicle. Let's assume for a moment it's an emerging market fund, so that means that it invests somewhere, maybe in Asia or maybe in Middle East or somewhere else in South America. Let's also assume that some of those parties are somewhere else, they're in Dublin or they're in Luxembourg. Then, of course, you can imagine how complex this can become when something actually happens, right? Because you talk about multi-jurisdictions and a multiple of legal settings. The investment manager has 3 roles which can potentially lead to conflict of interest, right? They launch the product, they manage the product, for which they, of course, derive the lion's share within the total expense ratio on fees, and they typically also have a representative on the board of that fund vehicle. And this is, of course, a good thing, given that they facilitate communication. However, we also need to watch out for conflicts of interest there. To what extent can a board be independent if the investment manager has, for example, a majority on the board of this fund vehicle? Added to that are these independent non-executive directors, which come from external. That's typically a role that my partners and I would take. You can imagine that those directors here sitting on the board having to overlook all this, this construct that is actually a pretty complex construct here. And I dare to say that in governance terms, the complexity of overlooking a construct like this is actually more demanding than an integrated corporate governance architecture. Just think about all the legal documents that you have to have with external parties, and the understanding that you need to have to successfully discharge your liabilities versus the shareholders. And having said that, here you got these investors, the fund shareholders, but the power, of course, is with the investment manager, and it is kind of tricky because those directors, they typically are under the purview, if you will, of the investment manager, but should actually represent the interest of the shareholder, which is the fiduciary duty that you know. This means, of course, that there's kind of a fine balance, right? I mean, in terms of managing the relationship with investment managers versus the interest of fund shareholders. So what I want to highlight with this is that this is actually quite a complex setup, especially if it spans multiple jurisdictions. I said here fund governance architecture. I mean, this is also something, what I mentioned, that you find in other outsourced setups, right? So a family office doesn't have their own bank, they use somebody else, and the same for small pension funds, etc. So this outsourced setup in some shape or form is also present in other investment vehicles, not only in funds. Okay. Stakeholders, we've mentioned that already a little bit. Regulators, of course, we haven't talked about this much, but regulators overlook fund structures and the other ones that I've just mentioned. I've talked about the best interest of the shareholders, which we need to be represented, but there are conflicts of interest potentially in this whole construct. The legal contracts between all the service providers, which is key. So you can't necessarily just fire a service provider. Well, you could, of course, change the legal contract, but you can't fire necessarily an individual employee. And fund board directors are limited to passive, indirect forms of influence, especially if you look at here the independent non-executive ones, they're outside, they're external, which means that they don't have necessarily the inside information that the investment manager directors typically would have on the board of such a product, which is of course tricky in terms of making decisions. Okay, so now that we know or are reminded how fund structures work and how fund products are quite special, talk a little bit about what's going on. Now, I'm not going to talk much about markets because we know it. Actually, we're so used to what's going on in markets. Since 2008, we're sort of used to capital markets being non-traditional and idiosyncratic and so on. We have regulatory requirements which are ongoing. We've seen that correlations go to 1 when there is any stress in the market. We've seen it in 2008. Actually, all kinds of things going on in capital markets which are quite tricky. Maybe till 10 years ago, not that prevalent. Okay, so actually markets are pretty complex to read. I recently saw a message from a pension fund saying they're going to slash their bond holdings to a large extent because I think bonds are getting too tricky. So for those of you, I know Eric, you were in the bond space. I think that bonds particularly, would be protection. Actually, we've seen risk all over the place, right? So markets are trickier than ever. At the same time, we also see changes in the operating model within asset managers. In the old days, people thought about outsourcing or back office tasks. We see all kinds of developments, even front office tasks being outsourced, the building of utilities, where some of the back office tasks get grouped together, etc. So you can sort of figure out where you are in this schedule. One thing I like to highlight is that, and I hope that it's not valid for your organization, but many organizations still sit on a lot of legacy systems, use Excel sheets for everything, etc. So technology is something that traditionally has been underinvested in over the years, and obviously we have more demands around technology nowadays for reporting purposes, etc., etc. So that is definitely something to keep an eye out, because basically all these activities and changes, particularly in these models, lead, of course, to operational risks. And if you think back about this slide, then obviously those risks are everywhere, right? These operational risks are with all the parties in this frame. Okay, so lots going on in the asset management space. The other thing I like to highlight is that where our risk understanding has come traditionally from, let's say, the Basel framework, market risk, credit risk, and op risk. Nowadays, we have all kinds of other risks that are prevalent, and not necessarily do they fall under these 3 risk categories. As a matter of fact, if you look at the risk in asset management, they typically are not necessarily the same as bank risks, right? We have nowadays things around conduct risk, with fraud and rogue traders and so on. We have model risk. We have other risks which are typically not falling under the Basel framework, which keep people busy, let's say. So the risks are actually all over the place, and some risk can materialize out of not only the capital markets pressures we've seen, but also out of the model changes in asset managers. And typically they don't fall under necessarily the Basel classification. Okay, so all kinds of risks in there, which are also relatively new. Anyone, cyber risk, etc. That's now also on everybody's mind, right? Okay. Of course, we can classify it as an op risk, as an operational risk, but we need to highlight and focus on all these individual risks nowadays. Okay, so all kinds of what I call idiosyncratic risks nowadays around there as well. This slide is too full. What I just want to highlight are 2-3 things. Actually, the smaller one, I like this diamond from Ingo Wolter. Typically, if you would go into a bank, At the first floor you'll have the market risk department, and the second floor you got the credit risk department, and the third floor you got the op risk department. And the reality is that those risks actually can quickly morph into another form. Something which becomes illiquid can become a credit risk, right? Or if you slice things, then a credit risk, it becomes a market risk, etc. Your system not loading the right data for valuation looks like a market risk because values are off. Actually, it was an operational risk. So what you see is that these risks actually can change into other forms of risk, and in my mind we do not pay enough attention to those things. The other thing, if you go down in this diamond, you see that these risks are becoming less and less quantifiable. And if anybody would ask me now today, okay, how do you model or quantify conduct risk, for example, I would have no clue, and I'll take any advice from anybody here. In German, they say mit Handkuss, because I necessarily wouldn't know that. The other thing I want to highlight out of this slide is that risk also changes over the life cycle. So where risk assessment is done, let's say at the launch of a fund, a year or 2 years into the fund life, actually risk may change character as well. So it needs an ongoing risk assessment. And obviously we all live off reputational risk in our business, which is more of a management task than anything else. And I like to call it extended enterprise risk management because it does include those third parties, right, that I've just shown you in the other graph. Okay. I'm going very fast, I have the feeling. So, in my mind, we need risk-based investment governance. Typically, if you look at, for example, to go back to fund structures, if you look at fund structures, you'll see directors that have taken their board seats out of regulatory requirements, Luxembourg and Ireland and so on. They need something. The question is the board then representative really of the risks that the vehicle is facing, and does it do a good job in discharging fiduciary responsibility? And in our mind, that is not always the case. We feel that governance need to have a much more risk orientation. Interestingly enough, IOSCO already over 10 years ago, IOSCO, the securities regulator in Madrid, over 10 years ago already said that the oversight should be in the interest of fund investors and not what they call fund insiders, i.e. asset managers. We need to have independence in those boards. We need to have a code of conduct and so on. Now, this is not new since 2006. What we now seen over the last 2 years or so is that regulators have become particularly active in filling those bullet points up. Let's say regulators in Europe under ESMA. But also the individual ones, and some of the regulators such as Ireland, but also others have become pretty active and also coordinate their actions to sort of fill these bullet points with life to fulfill the goal of investor protection. Key, of course, is the whole management of conflicts of interest, regardless of the structural form. So just now when I showed you this graph with all these outsourced parties, there can be, of course, all kinds of conflicts of interest in there depending on who is sitting where in the construct. Okay. Directors in those boards, what can they do and what can they not do? Sometimes regulators like to see directors as their long arm into structures, let's say. This is not necessarily the case because in the end a governance structure is there to help, of course, the fund structures to make them successful, to provide an extra layer of in my mind, risk management. On the one hand, risk management in terms of understanding the robustness of what I call the investment construct, so that is process, that is systems and all of these kind of things, but also understanding the risks which are taken within the strategy. And that leads to a kind of a quality conversation with asset management, which typically is valued. Okay, here it says fund promoter. That means the investment manager. So directors that come from the investment manager, they typically are involved in product structuring, understanding which service providers should be on board. Now the tricky thing is, of course, that service providers, and let's say a fund administrator, is being paid by the fund, i.e. is being paid by the investors. So where an investment manager chooses Northern Trust, Citco, or somebody else, that is actually a fiduciary duty, a fiduciary task. Because in the end, that needs to be done with, of course, the fund investor in mind. There is inside information, quote unquote, which helps, of course, in this case, the flow of the communication within the board. Typically, we rely on the risk management policies of the investment manager, which is then known in the boardroom, ratification of strategic decisions, and the whole reporting that talks to the service providers. And of course the conflicts of interest which are being managed. So typically if there is a board director that comes from the investment manager, in some cases this person will need to step back in certain questions. The non-execs, the external ones, they of course have a far lesser remit. They can only ratify. They keep oversight, and they can provide advice and guidance, but typically they're not inside of the firm, and therefore there's this big asymmetry as well. And good practice, I'm not going to say best practice. What is best practice? Well, good practice says that you should have a majority of independence on such boards. Okay. What kind of risks are there? NAV, of course, the net asset value, which is key for an investor. So typically, board should understand how the NAV is being calculated, that the assets are there, which means that there must be an understanding. Now, I'm not certain what experience you have with board directors. The question is a bit if board directors always are deep enough into the strategy or close enough to the investment manager and the service provider to actually understand what's going on in that investment construct and ask the questions. Identification and disclosure of risks, of course, and nowadays also increasingly in the focus compliant distribution. Especially US managers typically they don't necessarily know or are aware of what's needed to be compliant in Europe if you want to distribute in various countries in Europe or also in the Gulf, for example. Okay, and then again, the conflicts of interest. And what is special about conflicts of interest is that conflicts of interest may not only be present in a current setup, they can also become, they can actually emerge over time. So where it was interesting and good, let's say, to have the external lawyer that drafted your fund documentation on the board, once something goes wrong, is this lawyer then going to criticize his own fund documentation? And so independence is actually a multifaceted, not only lawyers can be in any function, let's say, right? So then when that happens, that situation, then we look back and say, well, wasn't it obvious that this could happen, that this is a conflict of interest which could happen? Well, it was not emphasized, of course, when we started out with a product, but a year into the product, actually, it happened. So, and then sort of you're stuck with the situation. Okay. So, actually, increasingly boards and that governance function is becoming more prevalent, more important. And the regulators particularly, but also investors are looking into the governance of those kind of structures. I was just saying to Alex, if you look at the very large houses, let me put it this way, the closer that the investor is to the money, and that is typically the case for small and middle-sized organizations, the more prevalent governance becomes. Typically, the family office patron would like to understand what's going on within the investments, potentially more than a large conglomerate company, let's say. Not necessarily because the company would not be interested, but because the people there have a different relationship to the assets than potentially the owners. Okay, so some formal requirements to do this. The question is, of course, that if you have no staff as a board director, how do you implement this as a board? And there is a framework that was published around almost 2 years ago now, where you see how this can be implemented. So here you see kind of a process. And actually, I know the person, this guy here, Frank Ennis. And Frank is a very experienced board director. And he has sort of come up with this framework. He's not an academic by no means, but he said this is sort of what makes governance logic. So you need to understand the fund, and you can ask yourself, right? I mean, all the directors that you have on fund structures, can they answer these questions? Do they know what the objectives are? Do they understand how the investment management process runs? Do they know all the documentation? They probably know, right? So you can sort of go through the cycle, risk profiling, which leads to a risk heat map, which we all know, of course, the governance framework, and then ongoing governance basically means, going back in the loop when changes happen. And not just, okay, we install a certain board structure and then we just run with it, whatever the circumstances are, but basically when things change, make changes also in the governance and looking at documentation, etc. Okay, so this is sort of a framework for implementing risk oversight, and as I say, you can go point by point through it to see how are we doing with this, and what needs to be improved. With that, I already come to my final remarks. Now, as we understand managerial, operational and legal elements of investing, so that has to do with this whole outsourced setup, right, which leads to all kinds of operational risk in the construct and legal risk, if you will. Understand that this is outsourced completely. Many stakeholders looking into this. We know that capital markets are, as I say, volatile and uncertain. At least they are uncertain. I think volatility is probably is low and has been low for some time already. We'll see what happens. Changing operating models. We have all kinds of idiosyncratic risks, and so we need to improve the governance of those investment constructs all around. Not just because the regulator tells us so, but also because, of course, investors are being served by it and they are interested in that. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I found this recently. So the whole thing around fiduciary management has shot up. So it seems that everybody's now looking into the fiduciary duties, let's say, that we all have in our industry. Any remarks or questions, ideas that you want to share, experiences? Chris?
I was actually wondering, the bulk of the risk categories that you were mentioning are risks that are not rewarded, so they're
yes,
non-compensated risks.
Yes.
Can you differentiate a little bit? Because on the market side, on the morphing category risk side, I guess part of that is actually rewarded, but most of the governance risks that you're talking about here are
yeah, that's quite a good observation. That's true. The obviously, the risk which you take as part of your investment strategy are the ones that you want to take, let's say, because that's how you want to create your performance. What I'm saying, even there in those kind of categories of risk, if you look at this diamond here, you can still bump into risks, let's say, which you didn't want. Right? If you think that you have a liquid strategy and it becomes illiquid because changes in markets, you end up instead of you end up with changing risk categories. So that is something that boards need to understand. Not only investment managers need to understand, of course, and they typically do, but also boards need to understand, to ask these questions to chief investment officers and CROs to understand, okay, what does your liquidity ladder look like? And what kind of assumptions are behind your models, etc. Now, it also means that boards need to understand and ask these questions. Now, to your other point, that's this one. If you look at these risks here, you see conduct and mis-selling risk. Investment risk is actually not even number one. And is credit risk there? Oh, yeah, counterparty credit risk is there. But reputation, operational risk, and these are not, to your point, they're not compensated. These are not risk categories that you budget for. These are not risk categories that you want to happen. You don't want these risks to materialize. Typically, we were just speaking before that with Mark as well about these kind of risks. Actually, they make that you lose, right? So you can even have a beautiful investment strategy and a performance track record, but an operational risk or any of those kind of operational risks, if you will, can cost you money, can cost your investors money, which is really not needed.
Follow-up question, if I may?
Please.
What happens if you have a whole forest of uncompensated risks?
Yeah.
Board of directors meetings are all talking about how can we avoid these categories of risks. Is there any attention span left, basically, for those categories of risk?
Yeah.
Today?
Yeah.
And that we entrepreneurially take?
It is tricky. So for smaller managers, they need to be busy with so many risks that it becomes almost prohibitive, let's say. So the larger managers will have definitely a benefit over that. Now, from a governance perspective, any directors would typically look at how robust our process is. So they would not necessarily go and judging is your cyber risk good or not. It is more, do you have a process in place that it covers with cyber risk? It still may materialize, right? But you don't go in there and say, okay, is that something you're non-executive in a board like that? And you need to rely on the risk management people that are active in that space. Your responsibility in the governance space is, of course, to understand that there is robust process in place, that there is risk identification, mitigation strategies, and all of those kind of things. But to your point, I mean, there has been so much sensitivity now over the last, since 2008 around compliance and risk, and all that, and some other governance functions that, you can ask questions around the entrepreneurial spirit and to what extent there is space for that in the asset management space. Typically for small managers or people who like to start out with a strategy, just the promise of an investment return is clearly not enough. If you are considering running your own fund, you need to bring 50,000 Swiss francs just to pay off, pay all the lawyers and accountants and what have you, just to create that structure. And then you have not earned a penny yet. So I typically advise people who want to do this to go to an asset manager and try to connect the strategy into their platform instead of running it themselves, unless they have deep pockets and they can fund this effort. Yeah, and not even talking about having to get to 100 million under management first before you start to make money. Let's say, yeah. Yes.
Maybe more from an investor's point of view, how reliable are regulations? So if I come as an investor, I usually don't have the insights to judge on all the governance of an investment fund. How reliable do you believe is a UCITS regulation?
Yeah. How reliable? So I'm a bit skeptical about the regulatory regimes, and I think the next crisis will probably highlight where the gaps are in regulation. So typically there are, in my mind, two things. Investors and retail investors are, of course, at a disadvantage because they can't have an informed judgment about the governance of things. Professional investors, they can actually up their game in terms of due diligence. And checking how governance is being maintained. The other thing is, of course, and I think that's something that the CFA Institute regulates through their code of ethics and standards of practice, is the behavior of people that are involved in the structure. There's certain things you do and certain things you don't. The UCITS framework, it remains to be tested. And I'm a bit skeptical, especially around things like, let's say, typically illiquid strategies like private equity strategy under a UCITS umbrella or so. And with the promise of liquidity when something goes wrong, we'll still have to see that.
So, but more on the kind of operational governance issues, do you believe the framework can work? I mean, independence decision. Of the investors.
Yeah, I think it can work. I think it can work. but you know, some of you and maybe yourself as well, and it also includes me, have the 2008 experience. And that was unbelievable, right? What happened in September '08. So I'm very wary about saying hard things about it, because I remember those days very well, and some of you are old enough also to remember those days very well. September '08. So I'm not gonna speak loud on this one. Yeah. Any other? Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. This is very interesting. One question about the different jurisdiction where we find most of the investment funds.
Yes.
Difference with Switzerland. So we have some funds in Switzerland, but most of them in Europe are in Luxembourg.
Yes.
And so on. What could explain these choices, and why it takes a relatively short amount of time to set up a structure in Luxembourg, for instance, compared to Switzerland, where it could take more than a year?
Yeah. It's true. So first of all, from a regulatory perspective, my observation is that especially the European domiciles are converging in terms of requirements. Obviously, if you want to market your fund, then it looks fantastic if you got a Luxembourg stamp or a Dublin stamp, because that speaks well, better than Malta or Channel Island. Well, Channel Island's fine, but or potentially Liechtenstein, let's say, even though you know you got great people there as well. So regulatory-wise, convergence in my mind, certainly under the ESMA banner. Now, dealing with the individual regulators, that's a different ballgame. Typically, US managers like to go through Dublin and Luxembourg, but a lot of Dublin, which means that if you ask the folks at CBI in Dublin, they got piles of applications. Whereas in Malta or Liechtenstein, it's far less. They can act far shorter. I recently listened to a gentleman from the FINMA last week, in fact. You know, potentially they don't have enough people to do this kind of work. So it's quite operational in the issues, if you will, of getting licensed, let's say. At the same time, there's pressure, of course, competition, which means that people will pressure on regulators in, you know, trying to sort of get through the process quicker. And what you see there is then that jurisdictions come out with, let's say, lightweight vehicles where notification or something is enough, right? So you see Gibraltar coming out. Okay, with us you can just send it through the mail, and you know a week later you get your stamp, and you can have a fund vehicle. And that's the same for some of the others, where they compete on getting business in, let's say. So, of course, you know, if you have a structure which is based in Gibraltar, which you're then going to market to clients, they may ask the question, why are you in Gibraltar? Why not in Luxembourg? It's a notorious argument. It's a notorious topic that that regulators are typically slow, especially the big ones. And to your point, a year, of course, is completely unacceptable. Being on a pile for a year before you can get authorization is a no-go. But it's operational. I don't think it's a regulatory thing necessarily. Yes.
That at some point in time there will be convergence between Ireland and Luxembourg?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, both jurisdictions are very strong within ESMA. And you know, there will still be competition, you know, and who's introducing a vehicle quicker than somebody else, let's say. But in terms of regulatory requirements, that is going to be pretty similar. Interestingly enough, jurisdictions like Singapore and Hong Kong have come out with new vehicles as well, which sort of mirror UCITS and Luxembourg structures. So you see, even though UCITS is a typical European structure, you see even convergence, you know, with other jurisdictions. And I've heard about, you know, when not the Paradise, what was the previous one, Panama Papers. When Panama Papers came out, that people in BVI became really nervous because they realized, like, oh my goodness, we are so far off in our governance standards, business is going to flow out. And we need to, you know, we need to change that to align ourselves more with international developments so that we can keep business in. Yeah, I definitely expect that. Yeah.
What about the technological risk and the fiduciary risk? I mean, you showed the example of the Google search that the fiduciary risk is quite on everyone's agenda. Why do those two score so low?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that fiduciary is not very well understood yet. I recently, well, Chris and I last week talked about this, like what's the German word for fiduciary? Treuhänder doesn't do it, right? So this whole thing about we are fiduciaries, we're playing with other people's money, and therefore we need to have put their interest first. By the way, it's quite a similar responsibility that you would expect from your medical doctor, from your doctor that you go there. That's the kind of an asymmetrical relationship right there. And also in the restaurant, right, where you take a coffee and you hope that you don't get sick of it. So this whole idea of fiduciary risk is not very well understood. And I think if you ask the average person in a bank or in an asset manager, they typically not necessarily do they see themselves as fiduciaries working with clients' money. So it is low, but not necessarily because I think it is a low risk, but more it's not very well understood. On the tax side of things, it's in my mind, it's my experience also a little bit, it's a bit of a same issue. We've always run billions on Excel sheets, so why should we change it? We just need a new regulation, or we just need to have an extra reporting thing around it, and that's it. Out of my September 2008 experience, I've seen things go really wrong when you rely on Excel sheets, because then all of a sudden you can't find your positions anymore, they're not marked to market, blah, 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 right? So as long as things go well, and that is typically the attitude that we have in our industry, things go well, right? We don't need tech investments, or investments in technology. But when things go wrong and we can't read our positions, and we don't have real-time data, etc., that's when we run into huge issues. And issues, in my mind, which we can to a large extent prevent. Because obviously, if you can trade quicker because you have real-time data instead of an Excel sheet which doesn't update, you can prevent losses. Yeah. Chris.
Any impact, or what's the water cooler talk about the impact of Brexit and FSA leaving,
yeah.
etc.?
Okay, so Brexit. I don't know. Brexit. There's a lot of talk, right, about it. I don't hear any definitive argumentation around Brexit for fund managers. I mean, they're looking at things, the obvious topics like distribution and so on. So it's difficult to pinpoint that down. What you do see is that people are moving folks from London to Dublin, especially in this space, in the asset management space. So there is things which are visible. The FSA. So the FSA, or is it FCA nowadays? They change abbreviation every 2 years, I think. But they are very active in regulating the investment space, let's say, and in that sense, they are not different than what ESMA in Europe is doing. So things like focus on transparency of fees, performance, closet tracking, that is valid for the FSA as well as it is for other European regulators.
What I wanted to actually ask is, the FCA has had a lead role within the European regulatory landscape.
Yeah.
And what is going to happen when we lose that lead role?
No, we don't lose it.
Well, that's the question.
In my mind, we will not lose it, because a large chunk of the European asset management business is going to be in London. Or still is, and it's going to be, in my mind. So we'll see. The FSA is very influential also in other bodies. I don't, not in the short term at least. I don't see that changing. Also, the FCA has done quite some publications over the last 12 months around what it is that they plan to do, which deal with things like transparency and fees and so on. And these are universal topics. And there are some other regulators like Ireland who are as pushy on these topics as the FCA is. Yeah, Eric.
I'm a little bit astonished that political risk is not.
Which one?
It's a political risk.
Yes. It's not listed here in the EY survey.
If I can give you an example.
Please.
For instance, even in Switzerland, we have political reasons. Suddenly, a tax on gold transactions, and we saw this vanishing from Zürich and going to London.
Yeah.
Just a small.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, we have risk coming up which we didn't know before. Recently, I was asked, Eelco, why don't you have Trump risk there? right? It's a good point. I mean, we have stuff materializing in front of us which require much more attention from managers and governance than there was before. And this is definitely a good example of that. Yeah. I mean, think about, you know, the impact potentially on investment strategy, right? With some things being abolished and so on, or put in place. All of a sudden, you can't run your strategy anymore because XYZ is no longer allowed. When the banks, you know, cut down on credit, on leverage, let's say, some strategies which are not necessarily market neutral had difficulty funding themselves, getting enough, you know, money in to sort of execute on their strategies, and became much smaller. Yeah. Any other? Koers?
You already mentioned the topic of fees, right?
Yeah.
And do you have a view on this? What is being discussed currently, and the pressure on fees, and how does this impact maybe your job and industry? Like we have the topics you mentioned already, the also index tracking. We have the FSA market study. We have the treat you fairly, client fairly topic, or activeness discussion, etc. What is your view on this? What's going on there, and what is maybe finally the impact be?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, no news in that sense that, you know, fees are under pressure and they all have to come down, especially if managers are not performing the strategy that they actually say that they are, and that it's becoming more closet tracking. You see the big ETF providers cutting their fees, whatever region there is, on, you know, percentage-wise massively, from a few basis points to even less basis points, right? So that is pretty tricky. I will see, what we expect is changes within the TER. So the TER, the large chunk of the TER, 80–90% is management fees, and the rest is, you know, directors and lawyers and accountants and whatever you need within the TER. And I think that we'll see changes there, where what I call those governance costs, be it auditors and lawyers and what have you, and directors, let's say, will be a higher chunk of the TER. The management fees will be lower within the TER, and potentially the whole TER coming down. I've also seen now some first tries with different models, if you will, around performance fees. So not a very simple, you know, for a hedge fund 2 and 20, but, you know, first of all, lower one, right, 1.7%, not 2%, but then also performance fees over, you know, a certain chunk of assets, and that will go to not 2 and 20, but, you know, 5 and 10%, and not necessarily 20. So I've seen that happening. I think people will become creative with, especially the performance fee calculation. Somehow what I have not seen yet is the argument, why don't we charge, why don't clients pay investment managers by the hour instead of by percentage of assets? Because if I trade 1,000 Nestle or 10,000 Nestle, it doesn't make a difference, right? But anyway, that's discussion for another time. I think people connected to banking say, well, line of credit costs a percentage, and therefore, but you know, it's the logic is questionable. Okay. Any other? Alex?
Any other questions?
Any other? No? Okay, I'm going to be around, so if anything you didn't dare to ask. Okay, thank you.